Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Yusuf Can. I'm in Washington, D.C. from the Wilson Center. We are going to be talking about what's happening in Turkey today with our esteemed guests, Berk Esen from Sabancı University, Istanbul, and Orçun Selçuk from Lutheran College here in the United States. Unfortunately, Ms. Gönül Tol, she was also a participant. She was also a panelist in this event today, but she had an emergency, so she's not going to be able to join us today. And she wanted me to convey her apologies to our audience. Again, she won't be able to join us today, unfortunately. I'm going to get right into the conversation. Uh, on March 19, 2025, Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, was charged and arrested with corruption charges and terrorism charges. The terrorism charges were later dropped, but the corruption charges became a big deal. And a number of other people, his associates, a lot of other opposition party members have been arrested so far. But there's also the bunch of other reasons why the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu is important. For example, Turkey's authoritarianism is growing, and the international pressures increasing in the Middle East. Erdogan is increasing his grip on power. In the meantime, and Turkish opposition is trying to organize and mobilize Turkish people against what's happening, not just to İmamoğlu, but across the Turkish democracy. So thank you again to our esteemed guests, Berk Esen and Orçun Selçuk. I'm going to get right into my questions. I'm going to start with Berk Esen. Uh, Dr. Esen, would you mind sharing your thoughts on what happened on March 19 and what's been happening since in Turkey? How does that relate to Turkish democracy, or what's happening across the world in terms of democratic backsliding? You worked extensively on the topic, so I'd like to hear your opinions on the matter. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Yusuf, for your kind invitation and also for organizing this very timely panel. I'm very glad to be joining the panel with Orçun Hoca. So I think the March 19 legal operation took place against the backdrop of nearly 15 years of autocratic legalism that's been exercised by the AKP government. So this is not necessarily an isolated incident. It's not really the first time that we're seeing the ruling party use judiciary in order to weaken, discredit, and eventually eliminate its political rivals. Between 2007 and 2013, we've had several very politicized trials that targeted secular neo-nationalist officers in the army, which eventually eroded the autonomy of the military. After 2013, we've seen the government go after Gezi Park protesters using very harsh police action and legal actions. Obviously, then the judiciary was used in order to completely decimate the Gülen movement within the bureaucracy, the military, the judiciary, and even in civil society. Many Gülen affiliated businesses, for instance, were confiscated. And finally, post 2016, as Turkish politics has become fairly authoritarian and Turkish democracy broke down, judiciary began to be used in a very targeted manner to undermine politicians within the opposition camp who had chances of stealing votes or siphoning votes away from the ruling party. First, obviously, Selahattin Demirtas and several moderate members of the Kurdish political movement were targeted in 2016, and this is still an ongoing process. And more recently, obviously, the March 19 legal operation, which targeted Ekrem İmamoğlu, but by extension, gradually, as this operation widens, we are seeing several CHP district mayors, as well as even the CHP leadership, being targeted. For the last 15 years, we've seen judiciary become and increasingly become a partisan tool at the hands of this government that uses the judiciary to undermine the political opposition, whether it be in the military, in civil society, or within political parties. So that I think needs to be said in a systematic manner to sort of put this operation in some kind of historical context. But I think despite all these legal interventions, Turkish democracy, yes, it gradually eroded, probably broke down sometime in 2015, in between the June and November 2015 elections. But despite this authoritarian term, the regime had preserved some competitive elements, largely due to the fact that opposition parties, particularly the main opposition party, could mobilize its supporters and score some election victories at the local level. And I think Ekrem İmamoğlu's rise as the mayor of Istanbul turned a presidential candidate was a very good example of the fact that government turnover could still happen in the Turkish context through the electoral path. Now, March 19 is a turning point because I think it represents a deliberate attempt by Erdogan to dismantle what remains of Turkey's electoral institutions. And I think the regime's goal, the government's goal, is to ensure that government turnover is no longer a viable option. I don't think that he wants to decimate opposition parties in total. I don't think that he wants to cancel elections. That would be unthinkable in the Turkish context. But what he wants to do is to redesign opposition parties' leaderships in such a way that they will not be able to put up a strong challenge in the electoral arena against İmamoğlu. Sorry, against Erdogan. And I think if this process succeeds, meaningful electoral competition will cease to exist in this country. So the motivation of the government, the way that I see it, is fairly clear, and I think they have gone for the juggernaut rather than sort of tinker with a number of low-level CHP politicians or go after district CHP mayors, as was the case prior to March 19. I think with March 19, they've gone for the top target. Will this succeed? Will this process succeed? At this point, I think the main opposition party did a good job of mobilizing its own base and even persuading some other opposition voters to take to the streets to join rallies in order to resist against such legal measures. And I think CHP at this point is the only organized political force in the country that is capable of resisting this attempt to consolidate an authoritarian regime. And as long as CHP leadership remains intact, as long as CHP organization can undertake such a campaign, they will be able to mount an electoral challenge. And I think this process will not succeed. At least it will not be able to consolidate this authoritarian regime. That is why, for instance, the regime is currently exerting pressure on the leadership. There is an ongoing case against the CHP leadership, an attempt to cancel the results of the most recent party convention of the CHP in order to change the leadership and hand over the chairmanship position to what I consider to be an ineffective and incompetent and an extremely unpopular politician, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. So I think one clear target at this point is CHP, and we need to look at what happens in that, in that battle. I think Erdogan's ability to mobilize his own base is somewhat constrained by the deepening economic crisis in the country. And as long as the economic situation does not improve, I think it's going to be difficult for Erdogan to mobilize his supporters and command a strong popularity going into the elections. Those two things are, those two factors are what I really follow at this point in order to understand whether or not this process will succeed. Final sentence. I think what lies ahead at this point, at least for the next year or so, is what I consider to be a prolonged war of attrition. I think the regime is going to hit hard at opposition journalists, opposition academics, opposition groups, and CHP. As of just half an hour ago, Fatih Altaylı, who I consider to be the most successful opposition journalist in the digital venue, with videos of his being watched by hundreds of thousands of people, has been arrested. So we're going to see such steps continue within the next few months. The court case against CHP is serious, and I think will continue again for some weeks, if not months. But at the same time, opposition is not going to be destroyed, and it's going to continue to push back. Who wins this prolonged war of attrition, I think, is going to come down to a confluence of factors, which we can discuss maybe in the subsequent rounds.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Thank you so much for that clear and comprehensive explanation of what happened and all the details, all the contextual information, the economic crisis, what's happening in Turkey since the 2010s and so forth. So, Dr. Selçuk, with further ado, I want to get to you. I'm going to ask you the same question. How do you view what's been happening in Turkey? It's a democratic backsliding, what happened in March 19, and what that means for Turkish democracy. And you have a you study Latin American politics too, so maybe you have some insights in that too, in terms of comparison or or the differences between
Mhm.
what's happening. So please,
Yeah, thank you. Thank
yeah.
you. Thanks for the invitation again, once again, and I'm also happy to be in the same panel with Professor Berkesan. I agree with all of his observations. I'll just add a few more perspectives on that. The way I see it is Erdogan is a leader, I would say in the first maybe 10 years, 10, 15 years of his presidency or prime minister initial presidency, Erdogan, despite turning more authoritarian, despite being more illiberal, majoritarian, he was still a popular leader, right? So he, a polarizing figure in the sense that he had a lot of people who didn't like him. They resisted him. But despite that, Erdogan controlled a comfortable majority in Turkish politics. You can see this in the election results where the opposition remained, the difference between the governing party and the opposition parties remained large. Erdogan, had relative, in this, at least in the first 10 years, had economic growth, better economic performance. So in that sense, I do agree with Professor Esen that Erdogan is popularity is going down, and I see this rising authoritarianism in the last few months, and not just the last few months, maybe the last year or so, at least since the end of the local elections in Turkey, as a response to this declining popularity of Erdogan. Because Erdogan, again, despite all of his authoritarian tendency, despite all of his power grabs, he did these power grabs supported by the people most of the times. But I think he has reached a point, especially after local elections, where his party was no longer the most, voted party in the country. He reached a conclusion, I think, that either he has to gradually give up power or he has to autocratize further. And I think he chose the second route. And the reason why he chose the second route is CHP right now is the leading opposition party, which refuses to institutionalize Erdogan's authoritarian system. What the way I say it again, Erdogan, in my opinion, again, the ultimate goal is not a closed autocracy like China or or Syria under Assad. I think the ideal goal is some form of elections, but again, very low chance of electoral turnover, as Berkesan just talked about. And I think the increasing repression towards CHP, the increasing repression towards İmamoğlu and journalists and whoever associated with the CHP has this angle. You asked about the comparative, Latin American component. For example, I think the closest example in that case would be the Venezuelan example, where Chavez, when he was alive, he was also very popular, at the same time authoritarian, but remained popular. And then his successor, when he lost his popularity after the opposition won significant parliamentary election, similarly decided to turn authoritarian. So in the sense, again, the way I see it is Erdogan would like to change the constitution, and CHP doesn't want to do it. CHP has enough seats, CHP plus some other opposition parties, they have enough seats in the parliament to block two things. They can block a constitutional change, and they can block a renewal of elections that will give Erdogan another term. And I think I wish we had again Gültol in the panel. Maybe she would have talked about that too. And I think I also see the ongoing Kurdish peace process in this context, right? That one of the things Erdogan has done over his career is Erdogan triumphed when the opposition was divided, when the opposition had didn't have a clear direction. In 2023, the opposition was united, but I agree that they were united behind a weak candidate, which I think helped Erdogan win an election. So Erdogan didn't really win the elections in 2023 because of his popularity, because the alternative was not any better for a significant majority of Turkish Turkish citizens. So in that way, I agree that the country is definitely has been autocratizing in at least the last 10 years or more. But I think the pace of autocratization, in other words, the country becoming authoritarian day by day, has become faster, has accelerated. And this is again not just a Turkish phenomenon. This is happening in other parts of the world. We talk about, I live in the United States, so similar concerns in the US, and I'm sure we'll talk about the international dimension a little bit later. But again, in other words, what's happening in Turkey is a response to opposition, especially under the Özgür Özel's leadership and under CHP. I think Özgür Özel has exceeded the expectations overall. He had a very tough job to take over a demoralized opposition, because if you follow the Turkish opposition after 2023 elections, they were demobilized, they were demoralized, and Özgür Özel, the change of leadership in the CHP sort of change those dynamics. And then I think under Özgür Özel, the CHP has further consolidated its power. For example, one of the smaller junior partner, I was in the 23 E Party, has weakened, and some of the E Party voters, I would say, eventually shifted to at least half of them shifted to the CHP. And İmamoğlu, again, he offered a different vision, because İmamoğlu defeated Erdogan. He never ran against Erdogan, but again in the Turkish politics, he ran against Erdogan's proxies in the local elections. In 2019, he won, and then they repeated the election, and he won again. And then the last election, he won even with a more decisive margin. So in that manner, İmamoğlu, I would say, is the only politician in Turkey who directly challenged Erdogan. And Erdogan, did not tolerate this, and he basically started this repressive campaign based on corruption, alleged corruption, and as you mentioned earlier, terrorism. These are very broad, I think, frames that are used in other similar regimes around the world to target the opposition. I agree. I think despite all this repression, there is still hope in Turkish politics. I don't think we are becoming like Russia yet. I don't think we're becoming a more close autocracy yet. But obviously, again, in this environment, we're not in a state of emergency right now, but it feels like it, right? In many ways. And I think a future campaign in a state of emergency, the fairness of that campaign I think, would be highly debatable, highly questionable. I think CHP will remain as an opposition party, but the big question mark I have in my head is the role of the pro-Kurdish party. Their voters are in the opposition. If you look at the public opinion survey, the voters of the pro-Kurdish party, DEM party, they pretty much align with the CHP voters in terms of how they perceive İmamoğlu's arrest, in terms of how they perceive Erdogan. But the DEM party elites, because of the negotiations with Öcalan, they have shifted their discourse. And I think at this point, I'm not 100% sure if DEM party is co-opted. Is it under co-optation? Has the DEM party already agreed to give Erdogan another term? Right? I think that's an important question. Or is DEM party going to side with the opposition? they sometimes visit İmamoğlu in prison, right? So I think there's still that power struggle with the ruling party, and CHP again respects the process, doesn't want to antagonize the Kurds, but I think that's one of the, maybe we can talk more about that, one of the, I would say, Achilles heels of the opposition in Turkey, that if the Kurdish movement, remains more independent of the CHP opposition, or feels or get co-opted by the AKP or Erdogan, I think it changes the calculus in Turkish politics. So yeah, I'll just leave it there, and then maybe we can talk more into other questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Selçuk, and thank you so much for bringing up the Kurdish peace process question. That's been one of the most important parts of this debate, not just about Imamoglu, but about Turkey's future. Because yes, there's a camp of that, people who are supportive of the process, people who want the quote unquote war to be over, the war between Turkish state and the PKK. There's also the group who are critical of the process because of its ambivalence, ambiguity, the political what's happening behind the curtain. People are questioning the motivations of actors involved, and if there's actually any kind of peace, quote unquote, peace and prosperity is possible under the current government in Turkey, as it, the way it treats any opposition is quite violent at this point. So I'm curious to hear your opinions about if this Kurdish. I personally, obviously, I'm the moderator, but my view, at least in brief, is that I think there's kind of slow down the process because of what's happening in Turkey. So I don't think any actor is actually quite happy about what's going on about the Kurdish peace process. But I want to hear your opinions. If you can, Dr. Esen, would you mind sharing your thoughts on the matter? Thank you.
I also pretty much agree with what Orçun Hoca mentioned with regards to the negotiation process with the Kurdish movement. I actually see two different negotiation processes that are currently taking place, and they are interrelated to one another, but are certainly apart from each other. So the first process, which I call to be the İmralı process, is negotiation that is taking place between Öcalan and the government, or at least certain figures within the government, which will probably result in Abdullah Öcalan emerging as the legitimate leader of the Kurdish political movement within Turkey, with DEM Party becoming co-opted by Öcalan in exchange for certain concessions being made by the government, improving the prison conditions of Abdullah Öcalan, maybe releasing of a release of certain political prisoners, maybe a promise to end government takeover of pro-Kurdish municipalities, the Kayyum practice. So in exchange for some very concrete concessions delivered by the government, the Kurdish movement would be asked to give political support. Now, to what end or to what extent is something that we don't yet know. Erdogan will certainly ask the Kurdish MPs to support an early election at a date of Erdogan's choosing. That I think is going to be a big win for Erdogan, but quite possibly Kurdish MPs will also be asked to support constitutional amendments to increase Erdogan's powers, maybe amend, change Turkey's electoral system in order to allow Erdogan to run for a third term. Maybe change the voting procedures so that Erdogan will be able to win this election without getting to 50% support. And maybe if the current election law remains intact, support from Kurdish voters in the second round of the presidential elections. In the 2023 elections, Kurdish voters supported Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the opposition's joint candidate, in overwhelming numbers. Not only in the first round, but even after this protocol was signed between Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and the Turkish ultra-nationalist leader Ümit Özdağ in the second round. So in this in the upcoming election, maybe some kind of a deal would be made to persuade the Kurdish movement to boycott the second round of the elections, which would, of course, tilt the electoral balance against the opposition. It may even create fertile ground, favorable ground for the government to engage in some electoral irregularities in Turkey's southeastern provinces, because there in that region, besides the ruling party, the only other party with an organizational capacity to oversee the vote counting process is the Kurdish movement. In the event of their election boycott, it's going to be very difficult for the opposition to monitor that process. So that's the domestic angle, or that's the domestic process. Now, there is also an international, there's also a negotiation process that is taking place at the international level, but I don't think that this is related to the Öcalan process. There, especially with regards to a new political and security architecture being established by Trump in Middle East, particularly in Syria, I think the Turkish government is waging talks with the current government of Syria, Saudi Arabia, US, and through indirect channels, Israel. I don't think that the Turkish government needs Abdullah Öcalan's approval in order to have positive results in this international process. There, I think Erdogan is playing a very high-level game, negotiating with these leaders. Now, most commentators, both in the pro-government side and also within the Kurdish movement, earnestly or deliberately suggesting that the domestic process with Öcalan started because of the situation in Syria. I doubt that that is the case. I doubt that the Turkish government really needs to undertake such a costly negotiation with Öcalan. And indeed, I think after Trump's election and after the quick collapse of the Damascus government, and then after it became clear that Israel was going to push for an operation in Iran, I think Erdogan realized that the international bargaining was very conducive for him to engage a power grab in Turkish domestic politics, hence the March 19 legal operation. And so that's why the İmralı process at this point is somewhat pushed behind. Erdogan already is getting what he wants in politics, and he's hoping that by negotiating with Trump, he will be able to get his way in Syria. And considering the fact that there does not seem to be a high level of popular support for the İmralı process among Turkish voters, at this point, it is risky for Erdogan to really take more drastic action, which is why, as Yusuf, you rightly mentioned, it seems that the İmralı process has slowed down. That doesn't mean that at some point Erdogan will not come around and restart the process. But I think before doing so, he will try to weaken the CHP camp as much as possible so that it will not be able to put up a strong resistance, and it will not be able to put up a democratic alternative to the İmralı process. That is, I think, what some Kurdish MPs, maybe Demirtas, as well as the leftist faction of CHP hope, right? They realize that the government is using the İmralı process to consolidate its authoritarian regime, but it also gives a small opening for the opposition to push for democratization. That's what they're trying to do. For instance, this statement that İmamoğlu released 2 days ago, after having met DEM party officials, says exactly that, right? If you want to settle the Kurdish question, you need to democratize. You need to take some democratization steps. İmamoğlu obviously knows that the government is not after that, but that gives him a chance to pay homage and support a negotiation process with regards to the Kurdish question, so that he doesn't alienate Kurdish voters, but at the same time continue to criticize the government. But that's a very delicate political game, and if Turkish politics continues to autocratize, I don't think that there'll be much room for that delicate game for the opposition.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Thank you so much for especially bringing up the international component of the peace process in Turkey, because the Syria, Iraq, U.S. involvement or Israel's involvement is much is part of the debate as well. So going back to Dr. Selçuk, obviously, you mentioned the Kurdish question, and then you tied it to what's happening in Turkey, and you can definitely elaborate on that. But I also want to go to the international question, because that's a big part of this whole İmamoğlu debate since day one. People were arguing that Erdogan actually had basically President Trump's approval before arresting İmamoğlu. That was the gossip. That was the political gossip of the day. So tying this to international context, what's happening since Trump's election in the United States, since what happened in Syria, the fall of Damascus, the fall of the Assad regime, and Iran and Israel's war between, and then now US is involved. So, from you talking about the Kurdish question to tying it to the international context in the Middle East, you want to, pitch in,
Yeah, so I think the
yeah.
Kurdish process, I agree. I think it's a highly opaque, behind closed doors, especially the negotiations with Öcalan, is taking place in a highly authoritarian manner. And it's basically, I think the fascinating part of it is in the 2023 election campaign, both, the AKP and MHP, they were very hard on their anti-Kurdish rhetoric. And in fact, they associated Kılıçdaroğlu with, being, like terrorist and terrorist sympathizer, even using some, deep fake videos during the campaign. And then they had a complete reversal now. Especially, I think it's fascinating, especially for outside observers, that the leader of the ultranationalist party, Devlet Bahçeli, who was the most, I was the hawkish person when it comes to the Kurdish issue, all of a sudden, became, oh, Öcalan should even, come to the parliament and speak. To me, again, it's very fascinating, and to me, that shows one thing, which is Erdogan and his coalition partners. They care about one thing: their political survival. And I think that's how I differ, not with Professor Essam, but with some other observers and commentators in Turkish politics who primarily look at Erdogan from an ideological point of view. The way I see Erdogan's political trajectory is he's a pragmatic leader who has allies one day who become his, biggest enemies the other day, and then those enemies could become allies and partners again in different political conjunctures, both domestically and internationally. So I think that what's happening with the Kurdish process in Turkey is surprising, but not too shocking, given Erdogan always had that Kurdish card to play. In the 2024 local elections, one of the reasons why İmamoğlu did so well is because the Kurdish voters again backed İmamoğlu. And again, Erdogan did see this, I think, calculus that as long as the Kurds and the CHP, they managed to support same candidates, they managed to stay together against Erdogan. It's an important threat. And as I mentioned earlier in the parliamentary calculus as well, that the ruling coalitions, all these things that Berkesan just mentioned, in the changing the electoral law, extending the tournament, things like that. Erdogan cannot do that on his own with the AKP and the MHPC. That's why, again, he either needs to convince the CHP, which I think this ongoing process is sort of trying to force the CHP to a negotiation, or to force or to encourage, to convince the pro-Kurd party that they should just go along with Erdogan's project in exchange for some concessions. So in that way, again, the CHP is, I think, not against this process completely because they want to see democratization. So I think there's a delicate balance. Unlike some other opposition parties like the E Party and the Zafer Party, so these parties are, I think, more clearly against the process. And in fact, Zafer Party's leader Ümit Özdağ, he was in prison also until a few days ago. So in that way, the repression is not just against CHP, but also some other opposition figures who I think has the potential to disrupt this grand plan, whatever whatever that is. International factors are important, I think, in Turkish politics, but I don't think Erdogan is acting like this just because of Trump's green light. And Trump factor is important in the sense that he doesn't care about, the liberal norms. He doesn't care about, human rights. He doesn't care about, targeting the opposition. And in fact, if you look at what's going on in the United States, there is also significant backsliding in the United States in the last few months, at least erosion of democratic norms. And then European Union, right? That there are some countries within the European Union who have more commitment to these values, but the European Union is, I think, also in crisis, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think in many ways, Erdogan, despite domestically again being more authoritarian, I think he has, at least in the last year or so, he has done a good job to manage between Russia and Ukraine. He has done a really, good job being pro-Palestinian in his discourse, but at the same time behind closed doors, working with Israel, working with Trump. So I think in many ways he is managing multiple important actors, both in the Middle East, both in Europe and other transatlantic with the United States, really well, so that it basically shields him from criticism and again, all these U.S. itself is, I think, American policymakers are right now alarmed by what's going on in the U.S. They're busy with topics like immigration and others, and now with the Iran. European Union, as I said, focusing on Ukraine, and the Middle East is basically on fire, right? Since October 7th. So I think this all favors Erdogan and Erdogan's power grab. It does become riskier. For example, if after this Iran conflict, if the oil prices go up, that's not good for the Turkish economy. Turkey is a country that doesn't produce oil and that depends on oil and natural resources. So in many ways, as I mentioned in the very beginning, it does boil down into whether Erdogan is able to reverse, the economic crisis, whether he is able to reverse his decline in popularity, and how he can achieve that is, I think, a big question mark. And then the Kurdish, given the CHP is not collaborating. And there was, again, some people on the Zoom might remember right after the 2024 elections, Erdogan and Özgür Özel, they met, right, the so-called normalization process, but that was rather short-lived, and then it didn't yield much result. And then Erdogan, in my opinion, had to carry the Kurdish card, the Öcalan card, so to say, to play. It is unpredictable in the sense that we don't know where it will lead in the Middle East. We don't know where it will lead in the broader region. We know that Trump at least will be in power for 3 more years, and again, he's a pragmatic leader. But at the same time, he's a leader who, similar to Erdogan, can change course pretty quickly. So I think the first Trump term, many Erdogan supporters remember it very, very well, but it was not, I don't think it was a very good time for Turkey, for Turkish economy either. So in many ways, I think Turkey's relationship with Israel, Turkey's relationship towards the Gaza, toward Turkey's policies toward the Gaza Strip has the, I think, potential to antagonize Trump, has the potential to antagonize Israel. Though, as I said, Erdogan so far has done a pretty good job in terms of his foreign policy maneuvers, trying to balance different sides. And all these things, I think, one more thing, just to pass it back to Yusuf. We all talk about, right, the global decline of democracy. So it's not just something that's happening in Turkey, it's something not happening in the United States. So in other words, again, the world is turning more autocratic and more authoritarian. And Erdogan is one of the prominent figures in this, I think, autocratic wave. And unfortunately, I think in the last few months, we are heading in a more authoritarian direction. Maybe the election of Trump and some other factors might have encouraged Erdogan or may given him the signal that it is acceptable. because at the end of the day, Imamoglu's arrest too at the international news, it was covered initially, and then I think most people uh, globally they consider him as another opposition figure who is jailed by an autocrat. Um, so I think it's important. Events like this, I think, is important for us to talk about this and then talk and then communicate to other audiences. But unfortunately, the world is focusing on some other global news items, and then that unfortunately favors a domestic agenda, which is more about perpetuating himself in power, staying in power beyond 2028, 2033. So I think that's the goal in mind, and the international factors are, I think, one bucket that helps Erdogan to achieve, but it's also a fragile bucket that could easily backfire if circumstances change in the Middle East or other Turkey's neighborhood more broadly.
Thank you, Dr. Selçuk. And before I get to Dr. Behsan, I want to remind people that you can ask your questions in the chat. So I'd appreciate that because we're going to get to that Q&A section in a minute. But before we do, I want to, turn back to Dr. Ehsan and ask, Dr. Selçuk mentioned the global component of democratic backsliding. This isn't just Turkey. This is all over the place, especially in former liberal societies, Europe, United States, and other parts of the world. So, and yes, I think that changes Erdogan's calculations. It gives him an advantage because the focus is not on Turkey as it was in the first couple of weeks, maybe in international media. I remember in the first couple of weeks after March 19, everybody was going crazy about what's happening in Turkey, and then it slowed down. That's expected. I'm not surprised by that because people have other things to worry about. Other societies, obviously. So, Dr. Hassan, do you think this? How do you tie what's happening globally to what's happening in Turkey and the election of Donald Trump and what came after that, but then not just Syria, but across the world. And Europe is in its own crisis. There's the whole, I see tweets about, how European government establishments, European institutions, European Union institutions are also having a legitimacy issue within it's so how does all this tie in your mind with what's happening in Turkey?
Well, in answering this question, I should probably point out that according to the Measurement of Freedom House, which is an organization that collects, that measures political rights and civil liberties on a yearly basis around the globe, since 2008, more countries around the globe autocratized or experienced democratic erosion than the number of countries that experienced democratization. So for the last 16, 17 years, we're already witnessing a global wave of autocratization. Part of it is related to cases like Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Brazil, India, Philippines, basically major middle income countries that experienced erosion, and at some point, most of these cases saw their democratic regimes collapsed. But also in already consolidated authoritarian regimes like Russia, China, we've seen those cases become even more autocratic. So, for instance, in China, previously it was really the Chinese, the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party that was running the country, and it was the party over the leader. It seems that for the last decade, Xi Jinping has reversed that process and really began to run his country with a tight fist. But also, and even probably more worrisome development has been that in established democracies in liberal West, we've seen democratic erosion. Rise of AfD in Germany, Front National in France, Reform Party in UK, Meloni has come to power in Italy, Wilders has come to power in Netherlands, and more importantly, of course, Donald Trump has come to power yet another time in the US and has really accelerated the process of democratic erosion in the US. So we are already witnessing this global wave of autocratization. So I don't think that international factors can be considered as a primary driver of autocratization in Turkey. I still attribute Turkey's autocratization to domestic factors. We can discuss what they are, but this global wave of autocratization has created enabling conditions, has enabled or has created favorable conditions for a populist autocrat to engage in a power grab, as we saw in the Turkish case. So when you have such a strong wave of autocratization happen at the global stage, it is difficult for a country like Turkey with weak political institutions, already a right-wing populist party entrenched in power, with a fairly skillful, shrewd leader in office to resist against autocratization. For the better part of the last decade, I think Western countries have very limited leverage over Turkey. In the case of EU, that's largely because of the migration crisis that erupted in 2015, but continues as a major issue. But obviously, post 2022, the Russo-Ukrainian war. For the US, it's the Russo-Ukrainian war and lately rising instability in the Middle East, right? Those developments have created a permissive environment for Erdogan to accelerate his power grab. And Western governments are not in a position to reverse this trend. They have already failed to do so in a case like Hungary, which is an EU member state. And lately, I think there is some support that is given to Erdogan in pushing for this course. Right? Several European governments, for instance, the Italian government, the Hungarian government, both far-right governments running their respective countries, but also the Labour Party government in UK enjoy really strong ties with the Turkish government, and they cooperate closely on a wide array of issues: trade, migration, even security. And I think these governments have enabled Erdogan to a large extent. The EU, for its part, has issued some mild criticism. I see European liberals and some social democrats in certain countries voice their concerns, their criticisms against this legal operation, but that has not yet translated into concrete action. I think the EU remains very openly embracing Erdogan's government, but many continue to cooperate. But it's really the US that we need to look up to. And I think Orçun Hoca probably follows the US case better than I do. We have not seen a formal condemnation from the White House. In fact, some statements that were made in the immediate aftermath of the March 19 operation suggest that the Trump administration has been complicit in this operation, that the two leaders had a phone conversation just a few days before the operation took place. And I think they had an understanding, probably that involved some developments that would take place in Middle Eastern politics. And we are now seeing with this attack against Iran what those were. Turkey's support or Turkey's complicity in these actions in exchange for Trump giving a free hand to Erdogan to do as he likes in Turkish domestic politics. Right? I'm referring to, for instance, a key Trump advisor saying good news is coming from Turkey in the immediate aftermath of this operation. So that makes it very difficult for the opposition to push back, because clearly the cost of suppression is very low. Right? So Erdogan knows that there won't really be much happening in the international arena to push back against what he's doing. I don't think that Erdogan would be able to undertake such steps in the 1990s or 2000s when China was not yet a major power. Russia was rather very weakened because of the end of Cold War, and EU could come up with all sorts of inducements in order to persuade countries to engage in democratization. We no longer live in that kind of a world. Having said that, I think vis-a-vis the Trump administration, Erdogan needs to walk a tight line. He's been very cautious to not antagonize Donald Trump. He knows the drastic consequences of doing that from the 2018 Pastor Brunson case, Donald Trump's tweets producing a run on the Turkish currency, which quite possibly costed Erdogan the 2019 local elections. So he's very careful to not antagonize Donald Trump. He is probably not all too pleased with U.S. attack on Iran because that attack commits U.S. even more so with Israel and saves Netanyahu and may pull U.S. further into that operation. I don't think that Erdogan is happy about that, but he's careful to not really openly criticize that operation. The Turkish government statement today was very cautious. So I think Erdogan's overall foreign policy vis-a-vis U.S., particularly pertaining to Middle East, is to leverage the Trump presidency to counterbalance Israeli power and influence in the region, and hope for some concessions from the Trump administration in Syria, which Erdogan can then use in the in Turkish domestic politics as a major victory, in exchange for Erdogan being a blind eye to what is happening in the rest of the region. Now that's a tight line, because if Trump commits further to this operation, then Netanyahu will gain the upper hand, and we know that Israelis are increasing their influence in Syria. They may not be up for any kind of an agreement with Erdogan. The Syrian Kurdish forces, the Iranian Kurdish forces will not be willing to lay down their arms, knowing that Israelis are very powerful in the region and Trump is backing them up. That is going to make it difficult for Erdogan to legitimize the so-called İmralı process in Turkish domestic politics. And of course, as the Israelis undertake such an aggressive foreign policy, expansionary policies in the region, continuing to attack Gaza, continuing to attack Iran, that is going to antagonize some pious voters who at some point will ask Erdogan to push back, and he won't. Those are, I think, areas where he needs to be very careful. But in final point, maybe wrapping up this, as a general rule of thumb, I think conflict in the region is always beneficial for Erdogan, and stability in the region is always bad for him. Because if you have stability, then Erdogan doesn't have two different camps to negotiate with, and he can't really effectively bargain. And stability will push for stability in Turkey or in Turkish politics. Conflict, however, gives Erdogan room to engage in diplomatic maneuver, play off the two different sides against each other to get better concessions, and it helps him to consolidate more power in Turkish domestic politics, which is why I'm very concerned about what is to come in Turkey in the coming months, partly because of this operation in Iran.
Thank you, Dr. Ehsan. You mentioned so many important points. I don't know where to start, but we got a lot of questions from our audience, and I want to combine some of them because there's overlapping questions there. You mentioned how Trump, damaged Turkish economy, potentially leading to Erdogan losing the 2019 local elections. There's people are asking, our audience is asking about the state of Turkish economy and the fragility of Turkish economy, how that might be part of this question, because as we know, Turkish central bank sold a whole bunch of reserves in the process, and that was one of the biggest discussions. Do you think, Dr. Selçuk, Dr. Ehsan, either of you can answer, do you think that's one of Erdogan's weaknesses, the state of Turkish economy, or some experts argue that Erdogan has actually learned to work with and not work with the bad economy, work with the economy that doesn't really work for the whole society, but kind of like, people are not happy about it, but they're not fully upset about the state of economy. So that's one question that either of you can potentially respond.
Yeah, I think, yes, I think the economy definitely matters, especially for electoral support, right, or no, non-support, or presidential approval. They're primarily, I think, driven around the world by economic evaluations. But what I would say, economy was also important in 2023 elections. But I think what is really important is perceptions of how people perceive the economy. And in the Turkish case, unfortunately, there's a partisan perception of the economy. So what that means is, if you are in the Erdogan's base, if you are someone who is already supporting Erdogan, exposed to pro-government TV and TV consumption, it's studies at least show that you're more likely to evaluate the economy in a more positive direction compared to how an opposition figure would evaluate the economy. That doesn't mean there aren't lived experiences. So people also experience the economy on a daily basis. I think the economy definitely matters, and we could counterfactually, I think, say if the economy was doing very well, maybe Erdogan didn't have to go in an this authoritarian direction, because he would be in a much more comfortable situation. But I also want to be cautious about the causal link between, if the economy goes further down the road, goes then people, I don't think people should expect the government to just to fall, or just to say we're gonna just pass it to the opposition. So in that way, I think one of the challenges of the opposition, and this applies for the foreign policy as well, there is problems, but the opposition needs to convince the people that it can actually fix these problems, right? And with the economy, I'm more convinced with the economy than foreign policy, for instance. I think the opposition has more, is more equipped, and it has more emphasis on Turkey's economic problems. Um, but I'm not quite sure, and I think that's one issue I would probably want to leverage in the next few years. I'm not quite sure if a foreign policy driven by the Turkish opposition in the future would put Turkey in a better situation compared to how it is in terms of its overall security. And Erdogan does use this. So it's a criticism of the opposition, in the sense that I think the opposition, CHP, overall looks weak when it comes to responding to foreign policy development, whereas Erdogan typically, leverages these security issues. So the economy is important. It erodes Erdogan's support, and Erdogan's support primarily came from working class, lower income voters. But I think economy itself doesn't guarantee an opposition victory in a future election, if that election is not going to be unfair, if opposition candidates are going to be arrested, things like that. I think we have a lot of uncertainty right now, and the economy is an important factor, but it's not the only factor.
Dr. Hassan, do you have any comments on this question?
Just a few short comments. I agree with pretty much everything that Orçun mentioned. I think just as we have, um, rather than a breakdown of the democratic regime overnight, a gradual process of democratic erosion. What we currently have in Turkey is that, rather than having a massive economic crisis that happened on one day, the kind that, for instance, we are accustomed to from 1990s Turkey, right? Three economic crises that happened over the course of 7 or 8 years. We have gradual economic downturn. So the government has managed to prevent a massive economic crisis by managing public debt, right? It's at manageable levels, by keeping unemployment rates at a certain point. They have postponed an economic crisis, which means that many people have jobs. Now, they don't earn enough income. They're desperate and they're losing money, but they can survive. Now, against the backdrop of that, the government can co-opt certain constituencies by distributing social assistance. And during an election year, they can pump some money into the economy, lower the interest rates, increase the minimum wage, increase the salaries of civil servants, hire hundreds of thousands of new civil servants, increase the pensioners' salary levels, can generate some confidence in consumer confidence in the economy and win the election, and then the economy once again achieves. So we are already seeing over the last 10 years that political cycle, right? Erdogan does that, wins the general election, say 2018, then loses the local election, wins the 2023 general election, loses the local election, right? Because it's the presidential elections that matter the most. Local elections, Erdogan can sort of manage. But I think after the rise of Ekrem İmamoğlu, even this policy no longer works. Orçun mentioned in his first response that Erdogan is no longer a very popular leader. You have in the case of Erdogan a populist leader who's no longer popular. Now that's an oxymoron. So his Erdogan's populist strategies no longer enable him to draw significant popular support. So he needs to get rid of the alternative. That's why he's going after the opposition. Because the CHP-run municipalities are also providing social assistance to the urban poor, that they're also reaching out to these constituencies, that they're actually doing a better job of running these municipalities. So an economic downturn and a clear opposition alternative is the winning formula. So far, we did not have the latter under Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's watch. Now, with İmamoğlu as the CHP's presidential candidate, I think the opposition finally found the winning formula. That's why Erdogan decided to go after the opposition. So the economy matters. I think the economic downturn is going to make it difficult for Erdogan to draw significant popular support. But if he can manage to decimate the opposition, particularly the main opposition party, then he will be able to win elections. And I guess this is Orçun's expertise. Venezuela is a great example. Now, they're not saying, they have different conditions. Venezuela is a renter state and so on. But you have clearly a case facing massive economic downturn for over a decade now, but still surviving through increased repression and opposition fragmentation. That might be Turkey's future. That's the worst case scenario, of course.
Thank you, Dr. Esen. Actually, I know we're over time, and I'm going to ask 5 more minutes from you, if that's okay. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go to the last question. You mentioned Turkey's future and how it can look in the coming days and months, and that's some of the questions. I'm going to combine them again because they're kind of similar in that regard. My question, or the audience's question, is that how do you assess the public reaction, the opposition, whether it's the organized political parties or the general public in Turkey? How do you assess the reaction, the protests, the boycotts, and all of that, the whole package of responding to the arrest of İmamoğlu? And building up on that, how do you assess what's going to happen tomorrow? And when I say tomorrow, in the coming days and months, in the sense that not just to İmamoğlu himself, but to Turkish opposition, how can the Turkish opposition continue, pushing back against Erdogan's power grab? Yeah, I think it's important to us in the last minutes of our panel today to to at least mention what happened, the people's reaction. The Istanbul University students, when people kind of lost hope, students kind of destroyed the police barricade and started this whole process. It wasn't organized opposition, but at the same time kind of died down. So how do you view the public reaction to what's happening in Turkey?
Yeah, I think something that was unprecedented was the protests, right? Because again, since the Gezi Park protests in Turkey, we didn't see really a huge mobilization of people in the streets against autocratization. And then I think under Özgür Özel's leadership, the CHP was able to show that it can mobilize people to the streets, and it could show its force, right? In terms of its ability to garner support and its ability to appeal to students, appeal to unemployed youth, ability to appeal to a broad segment of the people. And I think this is a since we're also talking about global issues, global trends, we probably need to, and the Turkish opposition, some of the questions I think we're focusing on that what can be done. I think the most important is to have a broad opposition that that basically encompasses a diverse group of people, right? That the CHP, I think one of the questions was focusing on the CHP as a big umbrella, a big tent party. And I think the CHP has been doing that, and it seems to be, I think they will continue to do that. In other words, pushing back against, I think, these autocratic grabs in a way, both domestically and internationally. And again, this is an event organized internationally, and we're in the Zoom space, right? And then trying to focus on, these power grabs, um, trying to focus on how we can organize, how we can push back, how we can have these spaces, both I think online and in-person spaces, despite I think knowing certain risks and certain repressive practices that we see on a daily basis. It is, I think, still important to maintain these pockets, and it's still important to maintain these pro-democracy spaces and these pro-democracy platforms. I think both in Turkey and internationally in the broader Turkish diaspora. I think the CHP is doing a good job overall to push back, but again, we don't know how things are going to turn out for CHP in the next weeks, next months, in the next years. I think regardless of what happens, it is important to maintain and keep this commitment to a democratic Turkey. And I think it's an important normative goal. Um, One of the weaknesses of the current regime, I think, in my opinion, has increasingly turned personalist, and we know that personalist autocracies are much more vulnerable compared to more institutionalized autocracies, and that may not be good news for Turkish opposition today and tomorrow, maybe next month. But eventually, the Turkish opposition, in my opinion, a day will come where it will be able to regain, at least push some democratization reforms, mainly because of the overly personalist, hyper-personalist nature of this regime. Because I think at this point, the current government doesn't really have much to offer other than standing behind Erdogan as a leader. They don't offer any vision for the country. They don't offer um, you know, a new developmental program for the country. It's primarily about survival and perpetuation in power. And the opposition, I think, can use this for its advantage if it plays its cards well, but at the same time knowing that its cards are limited by the government's actions, both domestically and also encouraged by some of the international factors. So I don't want to push for pessimism, right? I think we don't have the luxury to be very pessimistic. I think we have to be cautiously analyzing the situation, um, but at the same time, again, continue to organize, continue to resist in different spaces, and support candidates, politicians who are also agreeing with this vision. I think, despite everything, if you look at the public opinion polls, CHP is still, the public opinion polls I've seen, the CHP is still the most popular party in Turkey, and an overwhelming majority of Turkish people think that İmamoğlu's arrest is political, not actual judicial real investigation. And I think that should give some hope to the opposition, although there's also room for pessimism when I look at some of the cases in other parts of the world. So I think it's good to be cautious, but not demobilize, and just turn off completely from all these developments.
Thank you so much. Cautious optimism, I think, is the name of the game, at least nowadays. Dr. Esen, would you mind, sharing your thoughts on the same question? Thank you.
Sure. So we have witnessed an increasing process of autocratization for over a decade now, and despite these steps taken by the government, the opposition still remained vibrant, which is, I think, what kept Turkey in the competitive authoritarian column. Because in terms of press freedoms, academic freedoms, and other indicators, I think Turkey has fallen to the level of Venezuela, Russia, some of these more hegemonic authoritarian regimes. What really kept Turkish politics still competitive was the fact that opposition parties, in particular the main opposition party, could mobilize its supporters, draw voters to win elections, even in some sizable provinces like Istanbul and Ankara. I think the main reason for that is the diversity of Turkish society, right? You have an ethnic minority group, you have a religious minority group, so Alevis, Kurds, secular middle classes. Um, no matter what the government does, it is difficult to really eliminate that the presence of the opposition within the society, right? Because it's organic, right? You're not just simply voting for a political party just because of your ideas, but it also deals with lifestyle. It also deals with your religious or ethnic or political identity. So unlike Russia, unlike Belarus, Azerbaijan, it's going to be difficult for Erdogan to get to 60% support. I think at its worst day, right, there will always be potential for the opposition's pushback. And if anything, the demographic shift in Turkish society is working against this government rather than in favor of that government, right? So Turkey still has a fairly vibrant young population, and the young generation tends to be a lot more urban, educated, and secular than their parents and certainly their grandparents' generation. Now, is it possible to really reverse these trends through autocratic steps? I doubt it. That's a structural answer that I can give to create some grounds for optimism. So going back to Orçun's cautious optimism, which I share, right? That's what gives me some optimism. That time is not working to the benefit of this government. And they're going to have a succession crisis at some point. What worries me is that, of course, Erdogan knows this. And he's really desperate to get rid of the opposition so that he can consolidate an authoritarian regime before these structural organic changes in society have a political effect. So that's why it's really important for CHP to remain intact, for the current leadership to stay in their positions, and for them to continue a policy of societal mobilization. Because the structural components that I mentioned, they can affect politics only insofar as political organizations tap into this reservoir of discontented voters and figure out ways of mobilizing them. CHP has done a fairly good job, especially by the standards of Turkish politics, of mobilizing it, but I think they need to take this one step above, one notch above, because that's what the government is doing with its level of repression. So we need to see some extraordinary opposition coming from CHP. And I think the first battle that awaits us is the convention case. I don't know if a decision will be taken on June 30th, but CHP would need to, at some point, begin saying stuff like, we don't recognize this decision and we're fighting back, not just through weekly rallies, but so if you decide to appoint Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu to the CHP leadership, we're not leaving the CHP headquarters, right? You would need to come and occupy the building with the police forces, with your military, with your tanks. And it's going to be a very embarrassing moment for certainly collaborationist figures within CHP, like Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and his supporters. But it's going to be a very risky moment also for Erdogan. Faces trouble in the international arena, a weak economy, and so on, right? So the main opposition party need to be able to go. I think they did that in the Saraçhane rallies. Now this is the second step. with regards to the government's repression, I'm still trying to decide whether there is any method to this madness. So, has the repression spiraled out of control so that the government is very reactive and basically arresting anyone who talks, or whether this is a deliberate increase in the level of repression proportional to the opposition becoming stronger? I think there is some evidence to back up both arguments. We still don't know. That's why I use the analogy of, you might have, those of you who have listened to me in other occasions, you might have heard of me. I use this analogy. We're now, certainly for those of us who live in Turkey, we're now on a ship facing a massive storm in the middle of the ocean, right? And the storm is getting more powerful. I don't know if the ship is going to sink, but as someone living in Turkey, it is important for me to do everything I can to make sure that the ship will not sink, because the storm will dissipate. The storm will end at some point. And if the ship is still standing, I think there is a lot of hope. Given this organic opposition that I mentioned, when will the storm end? Economic factors, what happens to Trump, international, I think it's going to be a confluence of factors. But it's going to be difficult for the government to maintain this level of repression for 2 years, especially when the economy is doing so badly. But if people throw in the towel after 3 months, then this process will have culminated itself, and then we're going to look at a consolidated hegemonic authoritarian regime. And coming out of that is going to be very difficult.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hassan. I wish I could ask you more questions and continue our conversation, but we're well over our time, unfortunately. And we talked a whole bunch about what's happening to Turkey and Turkish democracy and the world. Honestly, it's a crazy moment in history, but it usually is anyhow. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Selçuk. Thank you so much, Dr. Hassan, for joining us today. And thank you to our audience. Thank you for participating on a Sunday morning or afternoon or whatever you are in the world or whatever time zone you are. Thank you so much, everybody. Yes, and hope to see
Thank
you
you.
and talk to you in better days. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.